Chapter 1. It was a chill, November evening in 1887 when the singular events I am about to relate first cast their shadow across the 221B Baker Street threshold. The fog, thick and yellow as pea soup, pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest, muffling the clatter of hansoms and the cries of street vendors that so often filled our little corner of London. I sat by the fire nursing a brandy and attempting to distract myself with the latest edition of The Lancet, though my thoughts drifted persistently to the war wounds that still ached in the damp. Beside me, Sherlock Holmes lounged in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his hawk-like eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the room. For 3 days he had been silent, save for the occasional scrape of his violin, and I knew well enough that such moods presaged either a descent into ennui or the arrival of a case to stir his restless mind. The knock at the door came sharp and sudden, shattering the stillness. Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up the stairs, followed by the tread of boots, hesitant yet purposeful. Holmes's eyes flickered with interest, and before our visitor could be announced, he murmured, "A man of means, Watson, but not of title. A merchant, perhaps, or a banker. His boots are new, yet scuffed at the toes. He has hastily brought a problem that Scotland Yard has already dismissed." I had scarce time to marvel at this deduction when Mrs. Hudson ushered in a stout, florid-faced gentleman of middle years, his overcoat dripping with the damp streets. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, revealing a mop of greying hair, plastered with perspiration, despite the cold. He introduced himself as Mr. Cornelius Hargreave, a wool merchant of some repute in Cheapside, and his manner bespoke a man teetering on the edge of despair. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice quavering, "I am at my wit's end. The police will do nothing. They say I am mad or a fool, but I swear to you, sir, I have seen him, the Spectral gentleman they call him, and he means to ruin me." Holmes leaned forward, his thin lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "Pray sit, Mr. Hargreave, and tell me everything from the beginning. Omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." The merchant sank into the chair I offered, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "It began a fortnight ago," he said. "I was returning, late from my warehouse in Aldgate, when I saw him, a figure in a black cloak standing beneath a gas lamp on Leadenhall Street. His face was obscured, but his eyes glowed like coals in a furnace. He raised a hand, pointed at me, and vanished into the fog. I thought it a trick of the light, or perhaps too much port, but the next night he appeared again, this time outside my home in Bloomsbury. He has grown bolder each night since, standing closer, silent as death. And now my business is crumbling." "How so?" I interjected, unable to contain my curiosity. Hargreave's eyes darted to me, wild with fear. "Orders cancelled without explanation, shipments lost. My best clients, men I've known for decades, refuse my calls. Yesterday, my warehouse manager found a note pinned to the door. 7 days, 7 clues, then ruin." The police laughed, called it a prank, but I knew it was him, the Spectral gentleman. "He's no phantom, Mr. Holmes, but a devil in human form." Holmes rose abruptly and paced to the window, peering into the swirling mist as though it might yield answers. "A curious tale," he mused. "And yet, Mr. Hargreave, I observe that you are not a man prone to flights of fancy, your cuffs are frayed, your collar stained with ink, marks of a practical mind, not a dreamer. Tell me, have you enemies? Rivals in trade, perhaps?" Hargreave shook his head vigorously. "None that I know of, sir. I've dealt fairly all my life." "Very well," Holmes said, turning back to us. "I shall take your case. Tomorrow, Watson and I will visit your warehouse and your home. In the meantime, keep a sharp eye and report any further sightings of this spectral gentleman directly to me." The merchant stammered his thanks and departed, leaving behind a palpable air of unease. I turned to Holmes, who had already resumed his seat, and was lighting his pipe with a match
Struck against the hearth.
"Well, Holmes," I ventured, "what do you make of it? A ghost, a madman, or some elaborate hoax?" Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes glinting with that peculiar fire I had come to associate with the thrill of the chase. "Ghosts do not leave," notes Watson, "nor do they orchestrate the downfall of wool merchants. No, this is a puzzle of human design, subtle, methodical, and I suspect deeply personal. But first, a small test of observation." He gestured to the rug where Hargreave had stood. "What did you notice about our visitor's boots?" I frowned, recalling the man's entrance. "They were wet from the fog, I suppose, and muddy." "Wet, yes," Holmes said, "but not muddy. The soles were clean, save for a faint dusting of white powder. Chalk, Watson, or perhaps lime, neither of which one would expect from the streets of Bloomsbury or Cheapside. Our merchant has been somewhere he did not mention, and that omission may prove significant." I stared at him once again, struck by the precision of his mind. "You think he's hiding something?" "Not necessarily," Holmes replied, tapping ash into the fire. "Men often conceal without deceit, merely through habit or fear. Tomorrow will tell us more. For now, let us rest, though I fancy this spectral gentleman will not grant us much peace." As I retired to my room that night, the fog seemed to thicken beyond the panes, and I could not shake the image of a cloaked figure with glowing eyes pointing silently into the dark. Little did I know that this was but the opening gambit in a game of wits that would test even Sherlock Holmes's unparalleled genius. Chapter 2. The morning following Mr. Cornelius Hargreaves' visit dawned grey and cheerless, with the previous night's fog lingering like a shroud over London. Sherlock Holmes was up before the sun, his energy galvanized by the prospect of a problem worthy of his talents. I found him at breakfast, poring over a map of the city, his long fingers tracing the winding streets of Aldgate and Cheapside with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "We shall begin at the warehouse, Watson," he announced, folding the map with a crisp snap. "A man's place of business is a mirror to his soul, more so perhaps than his home. If this spectral gentleman is indeed flesh and blood, he has left
His mark there, whether Hargreave knows it or not." I nodded, accustomed to Holmes's cryptic pronouncements, and within the hour we were rattling through the city in a four-wheeler.
The streets of Aldgate were a labyrinth of narrow lanes and looming warehouses, their brick facades stained black by years of coal smoke. Hargreaves' establishment stood at the end of a cobbled alley, a squat utilitarian building with a faded sign proclaiming Hargreave and Sons, Wool Merchants. The air carried the faint tang of damp wool and tar, and the distant clanging of dockside bells reminded me of the Thames lurking just beyond the haze. Hargreave awaited us at the entrance, his round face pale and drawn. Beside him stood a wiry, sharp-eyed man introduced as Mr. Jenkins, the warehouse manager. Jenkins tipped his cap with a curt nod, though his gaze lingered on Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "The note was found here," Hargreave said, leading us to the heavy oak door of the warehouse. He pointed to a rusted nail driven into the wood, from which a scrap of paper had been torn. "Jenkins discovered it yesterday morning. I've kept it safe, as you asked." He produced the note from his pocket, handing it to Holmes with trembling fingers. It was a small square of cheap paper used by tradesmen for invoices and bore a single line scrawled in black ink. 7 days, 7 clues, then ruin. The handwriting was angular and deliberate, with a slight tremor in the downstrokes, a detail I noted but could not interpret. Holmes examined the paper against the light, his keen eyes narrowing. "Machine-pressed stock, common enough," he murmured. "The ink is India black, fresh within 2 days. See the sheen? And the tremor suggests a hand either hurried or infirm. Curious?" He pocketed the note and turned to the door, crouching to inspect the nail and the surrounding wood. I watched him run his fingers over the grain, pausing at a faint scratch near the lock. "A blade," he said, almost to himself. "Not deep, but—"
"Recent. Someone tested the strength of this door, perhaps our cloaked friend." Jenkins snorted.
"Ain't no one broken in, Mr. Holmes. Locks are solid, and I check 'em every night." "Indeed," Holmes replied, rising with a faint smile. "Yet locks are not the only means of entry or influence. Let us see inside." The warehouse's interior was empty, a cavernous space, its high rafters lost in shadow. Bales of wool were stacked in neat rows, their earthy scent mingling with the mustiness of old wood. A single skylight, grimed with soot, cast a feeble glow over the scene, and the distant drip of water echoed from some unseen corner. Hargreave led us to his office, a cramped alcove partitioned by glass where ledgers and invoices lay across a desk. Holmes moved with the intensity of a hound on the scent, his gaze darting from floor to ceiling. He paused by a bale near the
office, kneeling to examine its coarse surface. "Watson," he called, beckoning me closer. "What do you make of this?" I peered at the wool, seeing nothing remarkable beyond its rough texture. "It's wool, Holmes, perhaps a bit damp from the weather."
"Damp, yes," he said, plucking a single fibre and holding it to the light. "But observe the colour, a faint reddish tinge not natural to the fleece, clay, Watson, and not the grey silt of the Thames. This is red clay, the sort found in Kent or Surrey. How does it come to be here, in a warehouse handling wool from Yorkshire?" I frowned, unable to offer an answer, while Hargreave shifted uncomfortably. "Could have been tracked in by a worker," he suggested. "We've men coming and going all day." "Perhaps," Holmes said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He moved to the office, where he quickly seized upon a ledger and flipped through its pages. "Your shipments have dwindled markedly in the past month," he observed. "Yet your expenses remain constant. Curious, for a man claiming no enemies." Hargreave bristled. "Trade ebbs and flows, Mr. Holmes. It's no secret." Holmes did not reply, instead turning to a small wastebasket beside the desk. From it, he retrieved a crumpled envelope, smoothing it flat with care. It bore no address, only a wax seal stamped with an unfamiliar crest, a lion, rampant, entwined with a serpent. "This is not your seal, I presume?" he asked, holding it up. Hargreave shook his head, his brow furrowing. "Never seen it before. Jenkins, do you know it?" The manager shrugged. "Not one of ours, sir. Could have been left by a client." Holmes slipped the envelope into his coat, his expression inscrutable. "We shall see. One last question, Mr. Hargreave. Where were you 2 nights ago between 8 and midnight?" The merchant blinked, caught off guard. "Why, at home, sir. My wife can vouch for me." "Very good," Holmes said, though I detected a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Watson, we have seen enough here. Let us return to Baker Street. I have a hypothesis forming, but it requires further data." I could not resist pressing him as we stepped back into the fog-shrouded alley. "Holmes, what do you make of it all? The clay, the seal, the scratch on the door? What does it mean?" He paused, lighting a cigarette with a match struck against the warehouse wall. It means, Watson, that our spectral gentleman is no mere phantom of the fog. He is a man with a purpose and a plan. The clay suggests a connection beyond London, the seal hints at a hidden player, and the scratch, which may be the first of our 7 clues. But come, the game is afoot, and I fancy we shall soon meet this gentleman face to face. The hansom rattled away into the mist, leaving me to ponder the enigma that lay before us, an enigma that, as yet, defied even my limited powers of deduction. Chapter 3. When we returned to Baker Street, the fog had thinned to a ghostly veil. Though the day's chill lingered in my bones, Sherlock Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, his mind alight with the threads of the mystery we had begun to unravel. No sooner had we settled by the fire than Mrs. Hudson announced a second visitor, a brusque, broad-shouldered man in the uniform of a Scotland Yard inspector, his face flushed with the exertion of haste. I recognized him at once as Inspector Lestrade, a frequent, if reluctant, ally in Holmes's endeavours. "Afternoon, Holmes," Lestrade said, tipping his hat with a grudging nod. "Dr. Watson, I hear you've taken up that Hargreave business, the Spectral. Gentleman nonsense. Well, you might have saved yourself the trouble. We've got our man and a tidy case too." Holmes raised an eyebrow, reclining in his armchair with a languid air that belied the sharpness of his gaze. "Indeed. Pray enlighten us, Lestrade. I am all ears." The inspector puffed out his chest, clearly relishing the moment. "One Josiah Blake, a former clerk of Hargreaves, sacked 3 months back for pilfering, caught with a bale of wool he'd meant to sell on the sly. He's bitter, having been heard muttering threats against his old master down at the docks. Last night, a constable nabbed him skulking near Hargreaves' warehouse, cloaked in black and carrying a knife. It fits the bill, doesn't spectral gentleman, unmasked as a common thief with a grudge. I felt satisfied with this news, for the explanation seemed plausible enough. A disgruntled employee, dismissed, in disgrace, might well seek revenge through intimidation and sabotage. The cloak and knife aligned neatly with Hargreaves' tale of a menacing figure, and the timing of Blake's capture, mere hours after the note's discovery, sealed the narrative with a bow. Holmes, however, appeared unmoved. He lit his pipe with deliberate care, exhaling a thin stream of smoke before replying. "A compelling theory, Lestrade. And what of the note? 7 days, 7 clues, then ruin. Did your man confess to its authorship?" Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "Not yet, but he's a surly devil, won't say much beyond curses. We found no paper or ink on him, but that doesn't mean he didn't write it earlier. He's our culprit. Mark my words." "Curious," Holmes murmured, his tone deceptively mild. "A man bent on ruin, yet apprehended before his scheme unfolds. And the red clay on Hargreaves' wool. Does Mr. Blake hail from Kent?" The inspector frowned. "Kent? No, born and bred in Stepney."
"As far as we know. What's clay got to do with it?" Holmes waved a dismissive hand. "A trifle, perhaps. I congratulate you, Lestrade."
"You have your suspect, and I shall not detain you further." Lestrade departed with a smug grin, leaving me to ponder the apparent resolution. "Well, Holmes," I said, "it seems a straightforward affair. Blake's motive is clear, and his presence near the warehouse damns him. Shall we inform Hargreaves the danger is past?" Holmes fixed me with a look of amused reproach. "My dear Watson, you are ever the optimist. Straightforward, you say? Tell me, does a man intent on a 7-day campaign of terror abandon his plan, to be caught like a rat in a trap on the 2nd day? And what of the wax seal, the lion and the serpent? Does a dockside clerk wield such heraldry?" I hesitated, the weight of his questions unsettling my certainty. "You think Blake is innocent?" "Not innocent," Holmes corrected, but perhaps not the architect of this drama. He may be a pawn or a convenient distraction. Come, Watson, we must see this fellow for ourselves. Lestrade's net is wide, but his vision is narrow. An hour later, we stood in the dim confines of a Scotland Yard holding cell where Josiah Blake sat hunched on a wooden bench. He was a lean, sallow-faced man of perhaps 30, with a mop of unkempt hair and eyes that burned with sullen defiance. His black cloak, patched and threadbare, lay folded beside him, and a short-bladed knife rested on the table, evidence, no doubt, of his ill intent. Holmes studied him in silence, his gaze sweeping from the man's scuffed boots to the calloused,
hands clenched in his lap.
"Mr. Blake," he began at last, "you stand accused of terrorizing Cornelius Hargreave." "What say you?" Blake sneered, his voice rough as gravel. "I say Hargreave's a skinflint who'd see a man starve afore paying a fair wage. Sacked me over a trifle. He did, and I ain't forgot it. But I ain't no ghost nor scribbler of notes. Last night I was near the warehouse and wanted to smash a window or two for spite. That's all." "And the knife?" I asked, gesturing to the blade. "For cutting rope, not throats," Blake snapped. "I work the docks now when I can." Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and probing. "Where were you 2 nights ago between 8 and midnight?" Blake's eyes flickered, a shadow of unease crossing his face. "At the Anchor and Crown, drinking with mates. Ask 'em if you like." Holmes nodded as though satisfied and turned to me. "Note the boots, Watson." "Mud, yes, but no chalk, no clay." And his hands, calloused but steady. This is not the tremor of our note writer. We left the cell in silence, though my mind buzzed with questions. As we emerged into the bustling yard, I could contain myself no longer. "Holmes, why was he there if Blake isn't the spectral gentleman? And who is behind this?" Holmes paused, his silhouette sharp against the gaslight. "Blake's presence is no coincidence, Watson, but it is too perfect, too pat. Someone wished him found, I wager, and timed it to divert our gaze. As for the true culprit, the clues multiply. The clay, the seal, the scratch, and now Blake himself. 4 already, and we have yet to find if Hargreaves' tormentor keeps his word." The fog had thickened once more, curling around us like a living thing, and I felt a chill that owed little to the weather. Blake's guilt had seemed inevitable, yet Holmes's logic cast it into doubt, leaving me to wonder who or what lurked behind the mask of the spectral gentleman. Chapter 4. The following day brought a rare break in the fog, though the sky above London remained a sullen grey, as if reluctant to yield to cheer. I awoke to find Sherlock Holmes already at work, his chemical apparatus spread across the dining table, a clutter of test tubes, burners, and jars that spoke of some nocturnal investigation. The faint scent of burnt wool and acid hung in the air, and I knew better than to ask for details until he was ready to share them. "Morning, Watson," he said, without looking up, his thin fingers adjusting a pipette over a glass slide. "I trust you slept well despite our spectral friend's machinations?" "Well enough," I replied, settling into my chair with a cup of tea. "Though I confess, Holmes, I'm still puzzled by yesterday. If Blake isn't our man, where do we turn next?" Holmes set down his tools and fixed me with a piercing stare. "Patience, my dear fellow. The web is wide, but its strands are beginning to converge. I fancy we shall visit Hargreaves' home this afternoon. There is more to learn from the merchant himself." Before I could press further, a telegram arrived from Inspector Lestrade, its contents brief but triumphant. "Blake weakening, admits to grudge but denies note. Case all but closed. L." I read it aloud, relieved that the matter might soon be settled. Holmes, however, gave a derisive snort. Lestrade's confidence is as predictable as the tide, and misplaced. Come, Watson, let us see what Bloomsbury reveals. By midday we stood before Hargreaves' residence, a handsome terraced house on a quiet square. Its brickwork was adorned with ivy that seemed to cling like a shroud. The merchant greeted us at the door, his florid face less haggard than before, though his eyes still darted nervously to the street beyond. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, ushering us into a drawing-room of modest elegance. "I heard from Scotland Yard that Blake's in custody." "Is it over then?" "So Lestrade believes," Holmes replied, his tone neutral. "But I prefer certainty to supposition. Tell me, Mr. Hargreave, has the spectral gentleman appeared since our last meeting?" Hargreave shook his head. "Not a sign of him, thank heavens. Perhaps Blake's arrest scared him off, if they weren't the same." Holmes offered no comment, instead pacing the room with his characteristic intensity. The space was comfortably furnished, a mahogany table, a velvet sofa, and a fireplace where embers glowed faintly. Above the mantel hung a portrait of Hargreaves, late father, a stern figure in merchant's attire, his gaze fixed on some distant horizon. I noted a faint crack in the frame, but thought little of it until Holmes paused beneath it, his head tilted as if listening to a silent whisper. "An impressive likeness," he remarked, fingering along the mantel's edge. "Your father built the business, I presume?" "Aye, sir," Hargreaves said proudly. "Started with a single cart and a handful of fleeces, worked his way up through grit and thrift." Holmes nodded, though his attention had shifted to a small brass box beside the hearth. It was unremarkable, save for a thin layer of dust, odd in a spotless room. He carefully lifted the lid, revealing a collection of old keys, their iron rusted with age. "Curious keepsakes," he murmured, turning one over. "From the warehouse, perhaps?" Hargreaves shrugged. "Family odds and ends, mostly. My wife insists on keeping them. Sentimental, you know." Holmes replaced the key and moved on, his silence suggesting a mind at work beneath the surface. We proceeded to the rear of the house, where a narrow garden stretched into the haze. Hargreave pointed to a spot beneath a leafless elm. "That's where I saw him last, standing there, pointing at me through the window. Gave me a turn, I can tell you." Holmes knelt by the tree, his magnifying glass glinting as he examined the earth. I saw only damp soil and a scattering of leaves, but he lingered over a faint indentation, a shallow groove, no more than an inch long. "A boot, perhaps," I ventured, eager to contribute. "Perhaps," Holmes echoed, though his tone was distracted. He rose abruptly and scanned the garden wall, his gaze settling on a loose brick near the gate. With a swift motion, he pried it free, revealing a hollow space within. He withdrew a folded slip of paper from it, its edges yellowed with age. I leaned closer as he unfolded it, revealing a single line in faded ink. "The fifth falls where the shadow bends." The script was elegant, unlike the crude scrawl of the warehouse note and bore no signature. "Good Lord," I exclaimed, "another clue!" "But how did you know?" Holmes silenced me with a raised hand, slipping the paper into his pocket. "A hypothesis, Watson, confirmed by observation. Say nothing of this to Hargreave, not yet." The merchant, who had watched from the doorway, approached with a frown. "What's that, Mr. Holmes? Something of mine?" "A trifle," Holmes replied smoothly. "A bit of debris, nothing more. We've seen enough here, I think." As we departed, I could scarcely contain my excitement. "Holmes, that note, it's the fifth clue, right? We're closing in." He smiled faintly, though his eyes were distant. "So it would seem. And yet, Watson, something jars, a discord in the melody. Lestrade and Hargreaves may rest easy with Blake in irons, but I am not so sanguine. Back at Baker Street, he retreated to his chemical corner, leaving me to mull over the day's findings. The groove in the garden, the hidden note, the dusty box of keys, all seemed to point to a more profound truth, yet I could not connect them. Lestrade's telegram echoed in my mind, and I clung to the hope that Blake's guilt would soon be proven, sparing Hargreave further torment. But Holmes's reticence gnawed at me, for I knew that when he withheld a discovery, it was no mere whim. That night, as the fire dwindled and the city slept, I heard the soft scrape of his violin, a mournful tune that spoke of shadows yet to be unveiled. Chapter 5. The days following our visit to Hargreaves' Bloomsbury home were marked by an uneasy calm, as though the city held its breath. Sherlock Holmes grew restless, his moods swinging from brooding silence to bursts of frenetic activity. He pored over maps, scribbled cryptic notes, and subjected the red clay from the warehouse to endless chemical tests, muttering to himself in a manner that suggested brilliance and vexation. I, meanwhile, clung to the hope that Josiah Blake's imprisonment had ended the affair, though Holmes's demeanour cast a shadow over my optimism. It was on the fourth evening since Hargreaves' initial visit that the storm broke. The clock had just struck 10 when a frantic pounding rattled the door of 221B Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, flustered but resolute, ushered in a breathless Cornelius Hargreave, his coat singed at the hem and his face streaked with soot. His eyes were wild, and his voice trembled as he gasped, "Mr. Holmes, it's happened again, worse than before." Holmes sprang from his chair, all traces of lethargy gone. "Calm yourself, man, and speak plainly. What has occurred?" Hargreave sank into a seat, clutching a handkerchief to his brow. "The warehouse, sir, it's gone up in flames. An hour ago, Jenkins sent word. Fire everywhere, bales burning like tinder. And there, amid it, I saw him, the spectral gentleman, cloaked as ever, standing across the street watching it burn." He raised his hand, just as before, and then vanished into the smoke. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. "Good
Heavens!" I exclaimed. "Was anyone hurt?" "No, thank God," Hargreave replied. "Jenkins and the night watchman got out, but the damage, half my stock, ruined. The fire brigade's there now, but it's too late. And this—" He thrust a crumpled paper
into Holmes's hand. "Found it pinned to my door when I left for Aldgate. Another cursed clue." Holmes unfolded the note with a steady hand, reading aloud. "6th comes the fire, 7th the fall." The script matched the warehouse note, angular, trembling, ominous. He turned it over, examining the paper against the lamplight, then slipped it into his pocket alongside the garden clue.
"6th?" I echoed, my mind racing. "Then we've missed one or more. Holmes, this is no petty vendetta. It's a campaign of destruction." "Indeed, Watson," he said, his voice low and taut. "And one executed with precision. We must go to Aldgate. At once. The ashes may speak where the flames have silenced." We arrived at the warehouse under a sky stained orange by the dying blaze.
The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of charred wool, and the fire brigade's hoses hissed as they doused the smouldering ruins. Jenkins, the manager, stood by the alley's mouth, his wiry frame hunched with exhaustion. He nodded grimly as we approached. "Started in the back near the office," he said. "No warning, just a whoosh, and up it went. Arson plain as day." Holmes wasted no time, striding into the wreckage with a lantern borrowed from a firefighter. I followed, coughing, as the smoke stung my lungs while Hargreave lingered behind, wringing his hands. The interior was a chaos of blackened beams and sodden bales, the skylight shattered above us. Holmes moved purposefully, his eyes darting over the debris like a hawk seeking prey. Near the office he paused, crouching beside a pile of ash that had once been ledgers. He sifted through it with gloved hands, retrieving a half-melted brass key, rusted like those in Hargreaves' box. "Interesting," he murmured, pocketing it without explanation. Then, turning to the wall, he traced a faint
mark, a scorch pattern radiating from a single point.
"Here's your origin, Watson. A chemical accelerant, I'd wager. Potassium chlorate, perhaps ignited by a timed fuse." I marvelled at his certainty, though I could discern little beyond the ruin. "But why, Holmes? If Blake's locked up, who did—"
"This?" He did not answer, instead darting to the alley outside where he scanned the cobbles with his glass.
"Footprints," he said, pointing to a smudged impression in the damp. "A man's boot, size 10, with a worn heel. Not Blake's. His were narrower. And here—" He plucked a shred of black cloth from a jagged brick. "Our spectral gentleman grows."
Careless. Hargreaves joined us, his face ashen. Then Blake wasn't the one?
"But the police see what is placed before them," Holmes snapped, his tone sharp with impatience. "This fire is no act of spite, but a step in a design I have yet to grasp fully. Tell me, Hargreave, have you received any unusual correspondence, offers, to buy your business, demands for payment?" The merchant shook his head, bewildered. "Nothing, sir. Just the cancellations and losses." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he turned away, pacing the alley with a restlessness I had seldom seen. "6 clues now," he muttered. "The scratch, the clay, the seal, Blake's framing, the garden note, and this fire. One remains, and it will be the key." I watched him, unsettled by the feverish glint in his gaze. "Holmes, you've some theory. Share it with me, at least." He paused, his silhouette stark against the flickering light. "Not yet, Watson. The pieces fit, but the picture eludes me. A shadow bends, a fire rises. There is a mind at work here, cold and calculating, and I must match it step for step." We returned to Baker Street in silence, the weight of the night pressing upon us. Hargreave retired to his home under Jenkins's care, while Holmes sank into his armchair, staring into the fire as though it held the answers he sought. I penned these notes by lamplight, my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the dawning realization that we faced an adversary as cunning as Holmes. As I laid down my pen, I heard him whisper, almost to himself, 7 clues, 7 days.
And time runs thin. The violin remained untouched that night, and I knew sleep would elude us both until the final stroke fell. Chapter 6. The morning after the warehouse fire dawned with a stillness that belied the turmoil of the previous night.
Sherlock Holmes emerged from his room with a gleam in his eye that I had come to associate with the turning of a case, a moment when the scattered threads of evidence began to weave into a pattern only he could see. He said little over breakfast, save to request that I accompany him to Scotland Yard at noon, and I sensed a plan brewing beneath his calm exterior. "We have 6 clues, Watson," he remarked as he donned his overcoat, "and the 7th looms near. Our spectral gentleman has played his hand boldly, but every gambler leaves an opening. Today we shall exploit it." I nodded, though I understood little of his intent, and soon we stood in Inspector Lestrade's cluttered office in the yard. The inspector greeted us with a weary sigh, his desk littered with reports of the Aldgate blaze. "Morning, Holmes," he said, rubbing his temples. "I suppose you've come to poke holes in my case again?" Blake's still in his cell, and I've half a mind to charge him with arson, evidence or not." Holmes smiled thinly. "Charge him if you wish, Lestrade, but you'll not catch your true quarry that way. I propose a different course, one that requires your cooperation." Lestrade leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Go on then." "Announce that Hargreave has fled London," Holmes said, his voice low and deliberate. "Let it be known through the evening papers and your constable's chatter that he departed this morning for the continent, driven by fear of further ruin. Leave no hint of doubt. Our man must believe the merchant beyond reach." The inspector frowned. "Fled? But Hargreaves at home, ain't he? What's the game?" "The game, Lestrade, is to lure a fox from its den," Holmes replied. "If Hargreave appears gone, the spectral gentleman may strike his final blow tonight or claim his prize. I shall ensure Hargreave is safe, and you must station men discreetly near his Bloomsbury home. Watch, but do not act unless I signal." Lestrade hesitated, then gave a grudging nod. "I'll play along, Holmes, but if this goes awry, it's on your head." With the trap set, we hastened to Hargreaves' residence, where we found the merchant pacing his drawing room, his nerves frayed to breaking. Holmes explained the ruse briskly, instructing him to remain indoors and extinguish all lights after dusk. "You are a ghost tonight, Mr. Hargreave," he said. "Your absence is our bait." Hargreave paled, but agreed, and as evening fell, Holmes and I took up our vigil. He had procured a pair of dark cloaks from a theatrical acquaintance, and we donned them to blend into the shadows of the square. The fog had returned, thicker than ever, cloaking the gas lamps in halos of yellow light. Holmes' plan, I deduced, was to impersonate Hargreaves' tormentor, or perhaps his prey, though he revealed little beyond a cryptic, "The seventh clue will come to us, Watson, if we but wait." Hours passed in tense silence, the cold seeping through my boots as we crouched behind a low wall opposite Hargreaves' house. My old war wound ached, but Holmes remained still as stone, his eyes fixed on the darkened windows. At last, near midnight, a figure emerged from the mist, a tall, cloaked shape, moving with purpose toward the garden gate. My heart quickened. The silhouette matched Hargreaves' description: black cloak, deliberate stride, and a faint glint where
eyes might glow. Holmes gripped my arm, his whisper barely audible.
"Steady, Watson, let him act." I realized the figure paused at the gate, producing a small object, a lantern, its shuttered light casting a narrow beam. He moved to the elm tree where Holmes had found the fifth clue, kneeling to dig at the base, with a gloved hand. Moments later, he withdrew a metal box, no larger than a cigar case, and slipped it into his cloak. Then, turning toward the house, he raised the lantern as if signaling or taunting. "Now!" Holmes hissed, springing forward with the agility of a cat. I followed, revolver in hand, as we closed the distance. The figure whirled at our approach, the lantern clattering to the ground, and for an instant I glimpsed a pale face beneath a hood, sharp-featured, with a scar tracing the jaw. He lunged toward the alley, but Holmes anticipated the move, seizing his cloak and hurling him against the wall. "Unhand me!" the man snarled, his voice low and cultured, hardly the dockside growl of Josiah Blake. He struggled, but Holmes pinned him with a strength that belied his lean frame. "Not yet, sir," Holmes said coolly. "You have something that belongs to this case and me." A whistle pierced the fog, Lestrade's signal, and within moments 2 constables emerged, their truncheons drawn. The man ceased resisting, his head bowing as cuffs clicked around his wrists. Holmes retrieved the fallen lantern and the metal box, prying it open to reveal a folded document, its edges brittle with age. "Well, Watson," he said, his breath visible in the chill, "here is our 7th clue, delivered as promised."
But the game has not yet been won. Only the players have revealed it. Lestrade arrived, panting, his face mixed with triumph and confusion. "Who's this, then? Not Blake, surely?" "No," Holmes replied, his gaze fixed on the prisoner. "A gentleman of higher station, I suspect, though his name eludes me for now."
"Take him to the yard, Lestrade, and guard that box. Watson and I will follow shortly." As the constables led the man away, I turned to Holmes, my mind reeling. "Holmes, you knew he'd come tonight?" "How?" He smiled faintly, adjusting his cloak. "A hypothesis, Watson, tested and confirmed. The fire was a feint, the clues a trail to this. Our spectral gentleman sought not ruin alone, but something Hargreave possessed. The rest awaits us at Baker Street." The fog swallowed the retreating figures, leaving me to marvel at Holmes's audacity and to dread the revelations yet to come. Chapter 7. The fog clung to London like a mourner's veil as we returned to 221B Baker Street, the captured man's metal box clutched in Holmes's hand. Inspector Lestrade had promised to hold the prisoner at Scotland Yard until morning, granting Holmes time to unravel the mystery that had consumed us for nearly a week. I settled by the fire, weary yet eager, while Holmes paced before the hearth, his sharp features illuminated by the flickering glow. The document from the box lay on the table, a yellowed deed, its ink faded but legible, and I sensed that within its lines lay the key to the spectral gentleman's design. "Well, Holmes," I ventured, breaking the silence, "you've caught your—"
"Man, will you now enlighten me, or must I wait for Lestrade to claim the credit?" Holmes chuckled, a rare sound that softened his usual austerity.
"Patience, Watson. The credit is ours, though Lestrade may crow as he pleases. Sit, and I shall lay bare the 7 clues that led us here, for they form a chain as elegant as it is sinister." He took his armchair, steepling his fingers, and began. "First, the scratch on the warehouse door, a blade's mark testing the lock's strength. Not the act of a random vandal, but a deliberate probe by one who knew its purpose would go unnoticed, save by me. It suggested a mind-planning entry, though not by force alone." I nodded, recalling his scrutiny at Aldgate. "But no break-in occurred." "Precisely," Holmes said. "This brings us to the 2nd clue, the red clay on the wool. Kentish soil is foreign to Yorkshire fleece or London streets." It pointed to an outsider, someone who had tracked it in, perhaps unknowingly, from a rural estate. Hargreave claimed no such visitors, yet the clay was fresh. "The 3rd clue," I interjected, "the wax seal with the lion and serpent?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "A heraldic emblem, Watson, not of Hargreave's making. I traced it later to the Crestwell family, a minor gentry from Kent, who landed but fell on hard times. It hinted at a connection, though its owner remained shadowed." I frowned, piecing it together. "And the 4th, Blake's arrest?" "A masterful misdirection," Holmes replied. "Josiah Blake, a disgruntled clerk, was too perfect a suspect, caught near the warehouse, cloaked and armed, yet lacking the note's tremor or the clay's trace. Someone ensured his presence that night, knowing Lestrade would pounce. A pawn, Watson, sacrificed to divert us." The memory of Blake's sullen defiance flashed before me. Then the 5th clue, the garden note. The 5th falls where the shadow bends. Holmes leaned forward, his voice quickening. "Found in Hargreave's wall, written in an older hand, it was no fresh threat, but a relic of intent, a riddle tied to the elm's shadow where our man dug last night. It led me to suspect a hidden prize, not mere ruin. The sixth clue, the fire, confirmed it. The warehouse blaze, I said, shuddering. Sixth comes the fire, seventh the fall. Arson, you said, with an accelerant. Indeed, Holmes agreed. A calculated act not to destroy Hargreaves' trade, but to flush him out, to make him flee as we pretended he had. After Blake's arrest, the fire's timing exposed the true culprit's impatience. This brings us to the seventh clue, the deed in this box. He lifted the document, reading aloud. A grant of land in Kent, dated 1842, ceding a parcel from one Edwin Crestwell to Cornelius Hargreaves' father Jacob. A modest plot, but rich in coal, worth a fortune today, though Hargreave never knew.
Its value, I stared, astonished. Coal? Then this was about money, not revenge? Precisely, Holmes said, setting the deed down.
Our spectral gentleman is Reginald Crestwell, last of his line, a man bankrupted by debt, desperate to reclaim what his grandfather lost. I confirmed his identity this morning through a telegram to Kentish archives, the scar on his jaw glimpsed in the fog, matching a local magistrate's description. But how did he know of the deed? I asked. Holmes tapped the table. Jacob Hargreave, a shrewd trader, kept it secret, storing it in that garden wall, a family trove forgotten by his son. Crestwell, researching his lineage, uncovered the transfer and resolved to retrieve it. The spectral gentleman was his invention, a phantom to terrify Hargreave into abandoning his home, leaving the deed unguarded. I marvelled at the scheme's intricacy. The notes, the sightings, all to drive Hargreave away. And more, Holmes added. The clay on the wool came from Crestwell's boots, tracked during a clandestine visit to the warehouse. The seal slipped. From a letter he discarded there, an error of arrogance. He framed Blake to stall us, and when that failed, he burned the warehouse to hasten Hargreaves' flight. The brass keys in Hargreaves' box, rusted like the one in the ashes, tied him to his father's legacy and Crestwell's target. I leaned back, the aha moment dawning. So the 7 clues were his steps, each a move to reclaim the deed? Exactly, Holmes said, his tone triumphant, yet weary. The scratch tested his entry, the clay betrayed his origin, the seal named. Him Blake misled us, the garden note pointed to the prize, the fire forced the game, and the deed sealed his fate. He underestimated one thing, me. I shook my head, awed by the clarity of his deduction, and Hargreaves' ruin, the lost orders, the cancellations. Crestwell's doing, Holmes replied. He bribed or threatened clients, sowing chaos to weaken. Hargreaves' resolve, a cruel but effective gambit. Silence fell, broken only by the crackling fire. At last I said, "You've done it again, Holmes. Lestrade will have his man, and Hargreaves his piece." Holmes waved a hand dismissively. The game
is won, Watson, but the thrill lies in the chase. Now pass me my pipe. I've earned a moment's rest.
As he lit it, I felt a familiar surge of admiration for his genius, a mind that turned shadows into light and 7 cryptic clues into a triumph of logic. Chapter 8. The first light of morning crept through the curtains of 221B Baker Street, casting a pale glow over the room where Sherlock Holmes and I had spent the night unravelling the mystery of the spectral gentleman. The fire had dwindled to embers, and the air held the faint tang of tobacco from Holmes's pipe, which he had smoked in quiet triumph after his exposition. I, too, felt a sense of victory, though it was tempered by the exhaustion of the past weeks. Trials. The deed lay safe on the table, a silent testament to the drama it had sparked, and I knew the time had come to see the affair to its end. Holmes rose with a stretch. his lean frame silhouetted against the window. "Come, Watson," he said, adjusting his cuffs. "Lestrade awaits us at the yard, and Hargreave deserves to know the truth. Let us tie up these loose ends before the day grows old." We arrived at Scotland Yard to find Inspector Lestrade in grudging satisfaction, his office bustling with constables and the clatter of typewriters. The prisoner, Reginald Crestwell, sat in a holding cell, his aristocratic bearing diminished but not erased by the night's ordeal. His cloak was gone, revealing a tailored suit now rumpled and stained, and the scar along his jaw stood stark against his pallor. He met Holmes's gaze with defiance and resignation, though he offered no words as we approached. "Well, Holmes," Lestrade said, tipping his hat. "You've landed us a bigger fish than Blake, I'll grant you that. This Cresswell's a gentleman, or was, Kentish. Squire fallen on hard times, confessed to the lot this morning, the notes, the fire, even the bribes to Hargreave's clients. Says he meant no murder, just to scare the merchant off that deed." Holmes nodded, his expression impassive. "A confession saves us the trouble of a trial's tedium, though his intent matters little. Arson and extortion carry their weight." I glanced at Cresswell, whose hands clenched the bars. "Why not simply ask Hargreave for the deed?" I asked. "A legal claim, perhaps?" Crestwell's lip curled. "Hargreave's father cheated mine, bought that land for a pittance when coal was a mere
rumour. My family's ruin began there, and I'd not beg from his son. I meant to take it back, as was my right." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Your right ended where the law began, sir. Your spectral theatrics were clever, but not clever enough." Lestrade
clapped a hand on my shoulder. "We got him cold, Doctor. He'll see the inside of Pentonville for this, and Blake's to be released, with a warning to keep his nose clean." I felt relief for Blake, whose pawn-like role had spared him a worse fate. "And Hargreave?" I asked. "He'll want to know his tormentors caught." "Send him a word," Holmes said to Lestrade, "and deliver the deed to him. It's his by right, coal or no. Let him decide its future." With that we left the yard, the morning air crisp and sharp after the fog's oppressive rain. Our next stop was Bloomsbury, where Cornelius Hargreave received us in his drawing room with gratitude and disbelief. The soot was gone from his face, though shadows lingered beneath his eyes, and his hands trembled as he took the deed from Holmes. "Coal, you say?" he murmured, staring at the document. "My father never spoke of it, kept it hidden all these years. And this Crestwell, he'd have burned me out for it?" "He very nearly did," I replied, recalling the warehouse's ruin. "But, thanks to Holmes, you're safe, and richer than you knew." Hargreave shook his head, a faint smile breaking through. "I'll rebuild, gentlemen, and see this coal puts my sons through better days than I've had. I owe you more than I can repay." Holmes waved off the thanks with his usual detachment. "Your safety is payment enough, Mr. Hargreave. The mind craves a puzzle, and yours obliged." We departed, leaving the merchant to his newfound fortune, and as our hansom rattled back toward Baker Street, I reflected on the case's twists. The Spectral. Gentleman, born of greed and cloaked in terror, had seemed an enigma beyond my grasp, yet Holmes had pierced its heart with logic as relentless as it was brilliant. The 7 clues, once scattered and obscure, now formed a narrative so clear I wondered how I'd missed it. The scratch a test, the clay a signature, the seal a lineage, Blake a decoy, the garden note a map, the fire a feint, and the deed is prize. Each step had led us here, and I felt once more that familiar awe at my friend's genius. "Holmes," I said as we neared home, "you turned chaos into order, as always. I'd have wagered on Blake to the end." He glanced at me, his grey eyes softening. You see, Watson, but you do not observe, a fault I cherish, for it keeps me sharp. Crestwell's scheme was a tapestry of misdirection, but every thread bore his mark if one looked close enough, I smiled, warmed by his rare candour. And Hargreaves' coal, will it change him, do you think? Perhaps, Holmes mused. Wealth alters men more than poverty ever could, but that is his tale now, not ours. Hansom stopped, and we stepped into Baker Street's familiar embrace. As I penned these final notes later that day, the memory of Crestwell's scarred face lingered, a man undone by his cunning, now bound for a cell while Hargreave reclaimed his legacy. Holmes, as ever, had seen through the fog where others faltered, and I knew this adventure would join the many-eyed chronicle with a mixture of pride and wonder. The fire crackled anew, and I closed my notebook, content that justice, or something like it, had prevailed. Chapter 9. The afternoon sun hung low. Over Baker Street, its rays piercing the last wisps of fog that had haunted London through our recent ordeal. The quiet of 221B was a balm after the tumult of the past week, and I found myself lingering by the window, gazing at the familiar bustle below, cabbies calling, vendors hawking, and the steady tread of a city returned to its rhythm. Inside, Sherlock Holmes lounged in his armchair, his long legs stretched toward the fire, a fresh pipe sending curls of smoke toward the ceiling. The deed, the notes, the spectral menace, all were resolved, yet I sensed the case still lingered in his mind as it did in mine. I turned from the window, settling into my chair with a sigh. "Well, Holmes," I said, "another triumph for your ledger. Hargreaves safe, Crestwell's bound for jail, and Lestrade's likely penning a report that'll omit half your work. I dare say you've outdone yourself this time." Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke, his grey eyes half-lidded with something akin to ennui. "Outdone myself, Watson? Hardly. The affair was a diverting puzzle, nothing more, a 7-piece mosaic with a few clever twists. Crestwell's ingenuity was his undoing. I merely followed, the crumbs he scattered. I shook my head, smiling at his modesty or his refusal to bask in praise. Crumbs, you call them? The scratch, the clay, the seal, each a needle in a haystack, yet you threaded them into a rope to hang him. I'd have stumbled over Blake and called, "It a day!" He waved a dismissive hand, the gesture as much a part of him as his hawk-like profile. "You underrate yourself, my dear fellow. Your steady presence keeps me tethered when the chase grows wild." As for Blake, he was but a shadow cast by a brighter light, Crestwell's flare of misdirection. The true game lay in the deeper strata, where motive and method danced. I leaned forward, intrigued by the philosophical turn. And what was the motive? At its core, greed, but something more, I think, perhaps pride or hunger for what was lost. Holmes paused, his pipe hovering mid-air as he considered. Pride, greed, desperation, a trinity as old as man himself. Crestwell saw in that deed not just wealth, but a restoration of his name, a defiance of time's erosion. Yet he forgot that shadows bend only so far before they break. His spectral guise was a mask for his fragility. A lesson, Watson, in the futility of grasping at ghosts. The words hung between us, heavy with a wisdom I rarely heard his voice. I thought of Crestwell, scarred and defiant, now reduced to a number in a prison ledger. Of Hargreave, unwittingly rich, rebuilding from ashes, and of Holmes, who had pierced their tangled fates with a clarity that bordered on the uncanny. "A lesson indeed," I murmured. "Though I suspect you'll not dwell on it long. You're already itching for the next riddle." He chuckled softly, tapping, ash into the hearth. The mind abhors a vacuum, Watson. This case filled a few idle hours, but London teems with unsolved enigmas. I heard a whisper this morning of a missing diplomat in Whitehall, perhaps a trifle, perhaps a thread to pull.
"We shall see," I laughed, the sound easing the last tension from my frame. "You're incorrigible, Holmes. Most men would rest on such laurels, yet you're off to the hunt again." "Rest is for the dull," he replied, rising with a stretch. "The world spins on and I with it. Now pass me that violin. I feel a strain of Bach coming on and it'll do us both good." I obliged, watching as he took the instrument and drew the bow across its strings.
The notes rose, crisp and melancholic, filling the room with a beauty that seemed to echo the complexity of the man himself. As I listened, I reflected on the strange alchemy of our partnership, his brilliance and my steadfastness woven together through cases like this one. The spectral gentleman had been no mere phantom, but a mirror to human folly, and Holmes had held it up with a precision that left me, as ever, in awe. The music shifted, lightening into a sprightly air, and I reached for my pen to finish these notes. The 7 clues had led us through fog and fire, from a merchant's terror to a gentleman's fall, and though the tale was done, its echoes lingered. Hargreave would prosper, Crestwell would fade, and Holmes would remain the enigma I'd never fully unravel, a mind as restless as the city he served. He set the violin aside as the final chord faded and glanced at me with a rare, fleeting smile. "Write it up if you must, Watson," he said. "But spare me the heroics. I'm no knight, merely a man who sees what others miss." "Too late," I replied, grinning. "The readers will have their hero and I'll have my truth." "You'll not escape admiration so easily," he shrugged, turning to the window as a hansom clattered past, and I knew his thoughts had already drifted to that missing diplomat, or some other shadow waiting to be chased. For my part, I closed my notebook with a sense of completion, yet a spark of curiosity lingered. What new mystery would call us next? Only time and Holmes would tell. The fire crackled, the street hummed, and Baker Street settled into its evening peace, a peace I knew would not last long. Chapter 10. A week had passed since the capture of Reginald Crestwell, and the chill of November had tightened its grip on London, frosting the windows of 221B, Baker Street with delicate patterns that caught the morning light. The affair of the spectral gentleman had faded from the headlines, supplanted by fresher scandals, though its echoes lingered in my mind as I sat at my desk, transcribing the final details of the case for my records. The fire burned low, casting a warm glow over the room, and Sherlock Holmes stood by the mantel, idly sorting a stack of telegrams that had accumulated in his restless absence from routine. The quiet was a rare luxury I savoured after the whirlwind of the past days. Hargreave sent a note of thanks 2 days prior, along with a generous cheque that Holmes had promptly redirected to Mrs. Hudson for the upkeep of our lodgings, a gesture as practical as dismissive of reward. Inspector Lestrade, too, had called briefly, grumbling about the paperwork Crestwell's arrest had entailed, though I detected a grudging respect in his parting nod to Holmes. The world had turned onward, yet I was drawn back to the 7 clues replaying their intricate dance in my memory. Holmes glanced over, catching my pensive stare. "Still brooding over our spectral friend, Watson?" he asked, his tone lightly mocking. "I'd have thought you'd consigned him to your little tales by now." I smiled, tapping my pen against the page. "I have, or nearly so. But I can't help wondering, did we miss anything? Crestwell's scheme was so meticulous, yet he fell so swiftly. It feels almost too neat." He set the telegrams down, and crossed to the window, peering into the street below. Neatness is the illusion of hindsight, my dear fellow. The man wove a web of his devising, and every strand bore his weight until it snapped. We missed nothing. His errors were his own, and I merely tugged where they frayed. I nodded, though a flicker of doubt lingered. And Hargreaves' coal do... You think he'll manage it wisely? A fortune like that could change a man. Holmes shrugged, his silhouette sharp against the frost. Wealth is a mirror, Watson. It reflects what's already there. Hargreaves a practical soul. He'll rebuild, provide for his sons, and likely bore his neighbours with tales of his haunted days. The coal's his burden now, not ours. His words carried the familiar ring of detachment. Yet I sensed a sense of satisfaction beneath them, a quiet pride in restoring order to a merchant's life. I returned to my notes, adding a line about Hargreaves' future, when a sharp rap at the door interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered, her apron dusted with flour, and handed Holmes a sealed envelope. "From the post, Mr. Holmes," she said. Marked urgent, though it's got no sender's name, Holmes took it with a raised brow, slicing it open with a letter knife. I watched as he scanned the contents, his expression shifting from curiosity to a faint, knowing smile. "Well, well," he murmured, folding the paper and slipping it into his pocket. "It seems our rest is short-lived, Watson." "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "Another case?" "A whisper of one," he replied, his voice laced with anticipation. "A diplomat's wife in Belgravia claims her husband's vanished, last seen with a coded letter and a stranger in a grey ulster. The Foreign Office is mum, but she's desperate. I fancy it's the same thread I caught wind of yesterday." I felt a thrill at the prospect, tempered by the ache of my still healing frame. "You'll take it, then?" "Of course," he said, retrieving his hat from the rack. "But first, a stroll to clear the cobwebs. Care to join me, or will you finish immortalizing?"
"Crestwell's folly," I laughed, setting my pen aside. "The tale can wait. A walk sounds just the thing, and perhaps a glimpse of this grey-ulstered stranger." We stepped into the crisp morning, the air biting my cheeks as we navigated Baker Street's
familiar chaos. Holmes moved with his usual purpose, his eyes scanning the crowd. Cabbies, newsboys, a flower girl with a tattered shawl, each a potential clue in the vast puzzle of London. I kept pace, my mind drifting back to the spectral gentleman. The fog-shrouded figure, the glowing eyes that were mere lantern tricks, the 7 clues that had tested even Holmes's genius. It had been a dark, twisting path, yet we were poised for the next. As we turned toward Regent's Park, Holmes spoke, his voice cutting through the hum of the street. "You know, Watson, every case is a shadow of the last, unique, yet tethered to the same human frailties. Crestwell sought to rewrite his past. This diplomat may be fleeing his. The game never ends, only the players change." I glanced at him, struck by the musing tone. "And you, Holmes, what do you seek in it all?" He paused a rare hesitation, then smiled faintly. "The chase, Watson. The moment when chaos yields to order. It's enough." We walked on, the park's bare trees looming ahead, and I felt the familiar stir of admiration mingled with curiosity. Crestwell's defeat had been a triumph of intellect over desperation, a tale I'd recount with relish, but already the horizon beckoned with new shadows. Holmes's words echoed in my mind. The game never ends, and I knew I'd follow him into its depths, as I always had. Back at Baker Street that evening, I'd add this epilogue to my ledger. A quiet, close to one adventure, a tantalizing hint of the next. The fire would burn, the violin might sing, and somewhere in London, a stranger in a grey ulster waited to be unmasked. For now, though, the frost sparkled, the city thrummed, and I walked beside a man whose brilliance lit the darkest corners, a companion, a genius, and an enigma I'd never tire of chronicling. Chapter 11. By the following morning, the frost had deepened over Baker Street, painting the cobblestones with a sheen that glittered under the weak November sun. Our walk to Regent's Park the previous day had left me invigorated, though Sherlock Holmes's cryptic mention of the missing diplomat and the grey-ulstered stranger lingered in my thoughts. I had intended to spend the day polishing my account of the Spectral gentleman, adding the final flourishes to a tale I felt confident would captivate my readers, when an unexpected visitor disrupted the quiet of 221B. It was mid-morning when Mrs. Hudson knocked, her face creased with mild alarm. "A young lad's here, Mr. Holmes," she said. "One of your irregulars, I reckon. Says it's urgent. Something about a warehouse." Holmes, who had been lounging with a chemical journal, sat up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Send him up, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, our spectral affair seems to offer one last whisper." Moments later, Wiggins, the wiry leader of Holmes's Baker Street irregulars, bounded in, his cap askew and his breath puffing in the chill. "Mornin', Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he said, grinning despite his haste. "Found something queer down by Hargreaves' old warehouse. Thought you'd want to know, seeing as it's your case." Holmes leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Out with it, Wiggins. What did you find?" The boy fished a small, soot-stained object from his pocket and held it up, a brass pocket watch, its face cracked, but its engraving still legible. "This, sir. Dug it out of the rubble where the fire was. Ain't no worker's ticker. Too fancy, with a crest on it." "Lion and snake, as you said once." I caught my breath, recognizing the description. "The Crestwell seal," I said, glancing at Holmes. "Reginald's, perhaps?" Holmes took the watch, turning it over with a meticulous eye. The case bore the same lion and serpent emblem we'd traced to the Kentish family, and a faint inscription inside read, R.C. 1879. He clicked it shut, his expression a blend of satisfaction and curiosity. "Well done, Wiggins," he said, shilling the boy. "You have a nose for the needle in the haystack. Off with you now. I'll call if I need more." Wiggins scampered out, leaving us with this unexpected relic. I watched as Holmes examined it further, his fingers tracing the dents and burns. "Crestwell's watch," I ventured. "Lost in the fire, I suppose, but why does it matter now? He's confessed, and the case is closed." Holmes rose, pacing to the window, with the watch in hand. "Closed, Watson, but not sealed. This is no mere trinket. It's a thread that pulls at the edges. Crestwell was at the warehouse that night, but this suggests he lingered longer than we thought, perhaps after setting the blaze. Why? I frowned, the implications stirring my curiosity. To ensure it burned, or to retrieve something else? "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, his gaze distant. "Or perhaps to meet someone." I said the fire was a feint, but its purpose may have been twofold: to drive Hargreave out and signal another player. This watch, dropped in haste, hints at a hurried exit, not the calm retreat of a man whose plan was complete. I leaned back, the familiar thrill of a new puzzle quickening my pulse. "Another player? You mean Crestwell wasn't alone in this?" Holmes turned, his smile faint but sharp. "A hypothesis, Watson, but one worth testing. Consider the bribes to Hargreaves' clients. Required funds Crestwell, bankrupt as he was, could scarcely muster. The timing of Blake's framing, the precision of the fire, there's a shadow behind the shadow, a hand that steadied his own. I stared at him, the neat resolution of the case fracturing anew. "Then who? A partner in Kent, perhaps, or someone here in London?" "That," Holmes said, pocketing the watch, "is a question for another day, or perhaps this very one. The diplomat's disappearance in Belgravia may be unconnected, yet I've learned to distrust coincidence. A grey ulster and a coded letter suggest a intrigue, and Crestwell's reach may extend beyond his cell." He moved to his desk, rifling through the telegrams until he found the one from the diplomat's wife. "We'll call on Mrs. Langley this afternoon," he declared. "But first, a wire to Lestrade. Let him ask Crestwell about this watch. A man in irons may loosen his tongue when pressed." I nodded, reaching for my coat. "And Hargreaves? Should we warn—" "Him? Not yet," Holmes replied. "He's safe for now, and ignorance is his shield. If there's a deeper game, we'll unearth it before it touches him again." We stepped into the frosty street, the watch a silent companion in Holmes's pocket, and I felt the stir of that old excitement, the sense that every closed door hid another to be opened. The spectral gentleman had been unmasked, his 7 clues deciphered, yet this small discovery reminded me of Holmes's maxim: "The truth is a tapestry, and one loose thread can unravel a broader weave." Crestwell's downfall had seemed final, but now I wondered if his shadow stretched further, entwining with the diplomat's fate in ways we'd yet to see. As we hailed a hansom, Holmes glanced at me, his eyes alight with the chase. "You'll add this
"To your chronicle, I suppose." "Of course," I said, grinning. "The readers will relish a twist, and I'll not let you escape the spotlight so easily."
He snorted, settling into the cab. "Write what you will, Watson, but spare me the laurels. The game's the thing, and it's far from over." The wheels rattled over the frost, carrying us toward Belgravia and the following enigma: the spectral gentleman. Tale had grown a postscript, and I knew my pen would follow wherever Holmes's mind led, a journey I'd never tire of sharing. Chapter 12. The frost had yielded to a thin drizzle by the time our hansom reached Scotland Yard, the grey afternoon casting a sombre veil over London's bustling heart. Sherlock Holmes and I had set out from Baker Street with the brass watch in hand, its cracked face and Crestwell seal a silent challenge to the neat conclusion of our recent adventure. The prospect of a hidden accomplice, or a deeper intrigue, had reignited Holmes's restless energy. I followed with equal parts anticipation and weariness, eager to see the spectral gentleman's tale laid fully to rest. Inspector Lestrade met us in his office, his desk a chaos of papers and coffee stains, his expression of mild irritation. "Back so soon, Holmes?" he said, eyeing the watch as Holmes placed it before him. "Thought you'd washed your hands of Crestwell. What's this, then?" "A remnant of the fire," Holmes replied, his tone crisp. "Found by my irregulars in the warehouse rubble. It bears Crestwell's mark, yet its presence there raises questions. I'd have you ask him about it, specifically who he met that night and why he lingered after the blaze was set." Lestrade frowned, turning the watch over in his hands. "He's confessed to everything. Arson, the notes, the lot. He said it was all his own doing." "You think he's lying?" "Not lying," Holmes said, "but omitting. A man of his means, or lack thereof, couldn't
orchestrate such a scheme alone. The bribes, the timing, there's a shadow behind him, and this watch may be the key."
"Press him, Lestrade, and press hard." The inspector sighed but nodded. "All right, I'll have a go at him. Wait here, I won't be long." We settled into the cramped office as Lestrade departed, the distant clang of cell doors and murmur of constables filling the silence. Holmes leaned against the wall, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm, while I pondered the watch's significance. "If Crestwell had a partner," I ventured, "could it tie to this diplomat business in Belgravia?" Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. A shrewd thought, Watson. The threads may intertwine. Grey ulsters and coded letters suggest a game beyond Kentish coal. But let us hear Crestwell first. Lestrade returned within the hour, his face flushed with triumph and chagrin. You were right, Holmes, he said, tossing a notepad onto the desk. Crestwell cracked when I showed him the watch, started blabbering like a man unburdened. It seems he wasn't alone after all. I leaned forward, pulse quickening. Who then? A fellow named Victor Marwood, Lestrade replied. Lowlife from the East End, ex-soldier turned fixer. Crestwell hired him to handle the dirty work, bribing clients, planting Blake as a scapegoat, even setting the fire. They met that night at the warehouse. Marwood sparked the blaze, and Crestwell stayed to ensure it took. Dropped the watch in the scramble when the watchman raised the alarm. Holmes nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Marwood. It's a name worth remembering. And where is he now? Gone to ground, Lestrade admitted. Crestwell says he scarpered after the fire, likely spooked, when Blake was nabbed. I've men out looking, but he's a slippery sort. I felt a pang of frustration, though Holmes seemed unperturbed. And the watch? I asked. Why leave it behind? Crestwell claims it was an
accident, Lestrade said.
Says it fell from his pocket as he fled, meant to meet Marwood later with the deed, split the profits once Hargreave bolted. Didn't reckon on you, Holmes. Holmes chuckled softly. Few do. Marwood's escape is a pity, but the picture's clear. Enough. Crestwell was the mind, Marwood the muscle, a partnership of convenience, undone by haste and hubris. Lestrade scratched his head. So that's it then? Case closed? Again? For now, Holmes replied, retrieving the watch. Keep Marwood's name in your files, Lestrade. He may surface yet, and I'll not forget him. As for Crestwell, let him stew. He's earned his chains. We left the yard as the drizzle thickened, the city's gas lamps flaring to life in the dusk. The revelation of Victor Marwood added a final layer to the spectral gentleman's tale, a shadow within a shadow, now vanished into London's underbelly. I felt a twinge of disappointment that he'd slipped our grasp, but Holmes's calm assurance steadied me. Back at Baker Street, we settled by the fire, the watch resting on the table like a trophy of our persistence. Well, Holmes, I said, warming my hands, you've tied the last knot. Crestwell's scheme had more hands than we guessed, but you saw through it all. He waved a dismissive hand, lighting his pipe. A minor flourish, Watson. Marwood's role was evident once the watch appeared. Only a fool works alone on such a scale. The 7 clues were Crestwell's design, but Marwood's shadow stretched them further. No matter, he's a ghost for another day. I smiled, reaching for my notebook. I'll add this to the tale, a postscript to your triumph. The readers will relish the twist. Relish what they will, he said, exhaling smoke. It's a trifle compared to what lies ahead. That Belgravia business calls Mrs. Langley awaits, and I fancy her diplomat's disappearance will prove more tangled than Crestwell's coal chase. I paused, pen hovering. You think Marwood's linked to it? A possibility, Holmes mused. The East End breeds men like him, tools for hire in games of power. We'll see soon enough, the fire crackled, and I finished my notes. The Spectral Gentleman's saga was now complete. 7 clues, 2 culprits, and a resolution born of Holmes's unrelenting logic. Crestwell languished in his cell, Marwood roamed free, and Hargreave rebuilt on a fortune he'd never sought. The watch, a final whisper from the ashes, had closed the circle, yet opened the door to the next. As Holmes reached for his violin, I felt the familiar stir of admiration and curiosity. The strains of a quiet melody filled the room, and I knew Our rest was but a breath before the chase resumed. The spectral gentleman was history, but London's shadows teemed with secrets, and Holmes would meet them as he always did, with a mind that turned chaos to clarity and a friend at his side to bear witness.